It began with one woman. In the sweltering summer of 1518, on the streets of Strasbourg, she stepped into the open and started to dance. There was no music, no celebration, and she didn't stop. Within days, dozens joined her, then hundreds. What followed would baffle doctors, unsettle authorities, and disappear from many of the records that should have preserved it. For centuries, scholars have searched for a cause, chemical, psychological, even spiritual, but no single theory holds. Some details were erased, others were never explained, and what remains is a trail of silence, buried names, and unmarked graves. The summer of 1518. In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, a woman stepped into the street and began to dance. Her name was Frau Traffia. According to entries in the city's administrative records, she started near the horse market, close to her residence. She moved without music, without a crowd, and without explanation. Witnesses observed her dancing for hours. She did not respond to questions. She did not stop when others tried to intervene. Over the next 4 to 6 days, she remained in constant motion. Accounts from local residents described her as exhausted, but unable to stop. At times, she collapsed, only to rise and resume the same repetitive gestures. Strasbourg at the time had a population of around 25,000. The city was an active commercial center in the Alsace region, intersected by trade routes between France and the German-speaking territories of the empire. Its municipal council was led by Jacob Sturm von Sturmeck, who would later play a role in the Protestant Reformation. By late July, the city council had taken official notice of the incident. Their surviving reports refer to it as a strange event, affecting not just one person, but many. Within days of Traffia's appearance, more individuals began to dance. By the end of the first week, city notaries counted at least 30 others participating. Some were neighbors, others arrived from surrounding districts. There was no festival, no organized music, and no known cause. Medical theories of the time attributed the condition to overheated blood, excessive bile, or spiritual imbalance. Strasbourg's physicians debated whether the event was a natural disease, a demonic possession, or the result of astrological misalignment. By early August, estimates ranged from 100 to 400 participants. Sources differ, but all agree that the number increased steadily through the first 2 weeks of the outbreak. Dancers were seen in public squares, on bridges, and near church steps. They showed signs of physical exhaustion, sweat-soaked clothing, trembling limbs, and in some cases, bleeding feet. Observers noted that the dancers did not appear to be enjoying themselves. Their movements were mechanical, often frantic. Some cried out, others were silent. Medical authorities began to prescribe treatments based on the prevailing theory of humorism. They believed the affected individuals needed to continue dancing to expel the excess heat or bile from their bodies. This led to the decision to construct temporary platforms and hire musicians to accompany the afflicted. The goal, as stated in the council's August 2nd report, was to allow the dancers to continue until they reach resolution. Payment records from city treasurers confirm expenses related to musicians, carpenters, and guards assigned to monitor the dancers. The location of these platforms was not random. One was erected near the grain exchange along the River Ill. Another stood beside the church of St. Vitus, whose patron saint had long been associated with involuntary movement disorders. References to St. Vitus's dance had appeared in religious literature as early as the 14th century, often linked to outbreaks of uncontrollable motion and spasms. Some believed these incidents to be acts of divine punishment. Others saw them as demonic in nature. The Strasbourg Chronicle, compiled by later writers using earlier sources, recounts that local authorities transported some of the worst-affected individuals to a shrine dedicated to St. Vitus, located in the Vosges Mountains. There, they were instructed to pray, receive holy water, and place offerings in the hope of receiving divine relief. The exact number of those sent to the shrine is not confirmed in the surviving records. The city council simply noted that they were removed for treatment of the soul and body. Despite these efforts, the outbreak did not cease immediately. Reports suggest that the dancing persisted for several more weeks, though precise timelines differ. Council records from August 16th mention a continued and inexplicable disturbance, while merchant letters preserved in regional archives describe scenes of people collapsing mid-motion in alleyways and courtyards. One letter, sent by a textile trader named Hans Burkhardt to his brother in Basel, described the dancers as having faces like ash, but feet that did not stop moving, even in sleep. The civic register for August 1518 contains entries for deaths attributed to exhaustion, fever, and heart failure. Some are annotated with references to collapse in the street. Burial records suggest a rise in unexplained deaths, though they do not always mention the dance directly. The municipal physician, whose name is not preserved in the surviving files, recommended temporary isolation of new cases. However, there is no evidence that any formal quarantine was enforced. As the dancing began to decline in early September, interest from officials also faded. No final count was made. No definitive diagnosis was reached. The council moved on to other matters, including the regulation of markets and disputes over trade levies. The city's clergy, who had initially expressed concern, issued no formal statement on the cause or meaning of the event. They did not classify it as heresy or as divine punishment in any public declaration. Their silence is recorded, but not explained. The Strasbourg dancing plague of 1518 is preserved in municipal archives. Medical treatises, and religious commentaries from the period. The sources differ in tone and detail, but they agree on the core facts. In the summer of 1518, for reasons no one could fully explain, hundreds of people in Strasbourg danced without rest. They did not dance for celebration. They danced until their bodies collapsed. Dancing toward death. By August 1518, the dancing in Strasbourg had spread to such a degree that it was no longer seen as an isolated occurrence. According to entries from the municipal council, the number of afflicted individuals grew rapidly. At its height, contemporary observers estimated that over 200 people were involved, with some documents suggesting numbers closer to 400. As the days passed, what had begun as involuntary motion became a threat to public health. Witnesses described individuals collapsing mid-step, their limbs still twitching as they fell to the ground. City records began to document cases of death. There were no autopsies, but burial logs noted sudden cardiac failure, exhaustion, and collapse. One entry on August 12 used the phrase ex motu, continua from continuous movement. A letter sent by a merchant to his brother in Basel stated that several people had died, with feet still twitching and mouths open in gasping breath. These were not theatrical movements. They were involuntary and sustained until the body failed. The city's physicians did not agree on the cause. Some believed it was due to overheated blood, a result of the summer heat. Others considered spiritual causes. Their theories were based on the Galenic model, which suggested that imbalances in bodily humors, particularly in excess of blood or bile, led to mania. Treatment varied. Some doctors recommended bloodletting. Others prescribed continued dancing, in hopes the patient would purge the imbalance naturally. To support this theory, authorities ordered the construction of wooden platforms. These were erected in high-traffic areas such as near the grain market and along the River Ill. Musicians were hired at city expense. Drummers and fiddlers played in shifts to encourage movement. The idea was not entertainment. It was based on the belief that dancers needed to exhaust the condition from their systems. Council records from August 10 show payments made to 2 fiddlers and a carpenter for this purpose. But as the dancers continued, their physical condition worsened. They moved even when their bodies failed them. Some witnesses claimed people danced in their sleep. Others described participants with vacant expressions, mouths moving as if in silent prayer. A few dancers screamed, though the cause of their distress was unclear. One account recorded by a local notary stated that a man danced with bleeding feet until he fell backwards and did not rise. Medical personnel tried interventions. Cold water, herbal compresses, and isolation were attempted. None succeeded. Some individuals were taken to religious sites. The shrine of St. Vitus, located in the Vosges Mountains, was one such destination. Vitus was believed to protect against involuntary movement. The city chartered carts to transport patients under supervision. Records confirmed the transport, but there is no documentation on what happened after their arrival. As the death toll rose, public fear increased. Markets operated on shorter hours. Families kept children indoors. Religious leaders said little. The cathedral issued no official guidance. While individual clergy offered prayers, there was no unified church position during the height of the outbreak. This silence was noted by several guild members who sent a petition to the bishop asking for direction. No reply survives. Reports of death continued through August. Burial records listed causes such as exhaustion and collapse. However, most were labeled with vague phrases: fever, weakness, sudden expiration. Some entries were marked only by initials. Whether these individuals died directly from the dancing or from related complications remains uncertain. Letters from Strasbourg residents during this period reflect confusion and fear. One cobbler wrote to a cousin in Colmar that the streets bleed and echo with footsteps that will not stop. A baker noted that customers avoided the fish market, where dancers were often seen collapsing. A wine merchant claimed the air near the river Ill felt thick and wrong. The medical response began to fracture. Some physicians stopped attending the dancers altogether. Others continued to apply traditional remedies, including vinegar compressors and herbal powders. By late August, no new treatments were being recorded. The effort had become one of containment rather than cure. Civic leaders debated whether to involve outside help. A proposal to bring in physicians from Basel was considered, but never implemented. One council note from August 19th stated that no foreign advice would alter what heaven has set in motion. This reflects a shift in attitude. Where earlier documents had framed the dancing as a physical condition, later entries began using moral or religious language. No one claimed responsibility for declaring the event over. There was no formal end date. The cases declined gradually. By early September, mentions of dancing in public records decreased. The final council reference appears on September 5th, noting a return to order in the grain market area. No summary was offered. No explanation was given. Modern historians disagree on the number of deaths. Estimates range from a few dozen to nearly 100, but contemporary Strasbourg sources do not provide exact figures. What they do record is a pattern: people dancing without rest, their health declining rapidly, and city officials unsure how to respond. The 1518 Strasbourg dancing outbreak remains unique in its scale and documentation. There were other cases of dancing mania in Europe, but few matched the number of participants or the level of civic response. Despite efforts by physicians, musicians, and clergy, no one could explain why so many continued to move even as their bodies broke down. The forgotten precedents. The dancing plague that gripped Strasbourg in 1518 was not without precedent. More than a century earlier, cities across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond had recorded cases of similar outbreaks, though the details were often fragmented and the responses inconsistent. The symptoms: uncontrolled movement, collapse from exhaustion, and unexplained origins were documented in official and religious records. Despite this, many of these events faded from collective memory, left unexamined by later authorities. The most widely cited early case occurred in Aachen in the summer of 1374, located in present-day Germany. Aachen witnessed hundreds of people moving in unison through city streets. Reports described participants convulsing, leaping, and dancing without rest. Eyewitnesses claimed some screamed for help, some sang, and others fell unconscious. Chroniclers noted the movement was not coordinated or festive, but erratic and compulsive. Many collapsed from exhaustion, and some were believed to have died. The event was serious enough that local authorities banned music in public areas and attempted to disperse the crowds. Other outbreaks followed. In 1375, similar accounts emerged from Cologne. In 1381, the city of Metz, located along the Moselle River, recorded an incident involving dozens of individuals. Their condition was described as choreic, a term used for disorders involving involuntary motion. While these reports differed in detail, they shared a key feature: the participants danced against their will and could not stop. Authorities often responded with prayer, processions, or isolation. Still, no consistent explanation was reached. By the 15th century, smaller episodes were being recorded across the Low Countries. In 1413, Utrecht documented a brief outbreak involving a group of pilgrims who began moving uncontrollably during a church gathering. Their behavior disrupted the Mass, and several were removed from the building. The official report labeled the incident demonic in character. No follow-up action was recorded. In the 1420s, villages in the Alsace region also reported strange group behavior, though few municipal documents from these areas survive in full. One of the more unusual outbreaks occurred in Apulia, southern Italy, where records from 1480 describe a different explanation. Victims claimed they had been bitten by a tarantula and were compelled to dance to prevent death. This belief led to the development of the tarantella, a musical rhythm intended to counteract the poison. Physicians at the time debated whether the spider's bite could produce such symptoms, but no consensus was reached. Regardless of its origin, the dancing in Apulia mirrored the same compulsive energy seen elsewhere in Europe. The repeated appearance of these events caught the attention of later physicians. Among them was Paracelsus, the Swiss physician and alchemist active in the early 16th century. He wrote extensively about what he called chorea, sancti vitae, or Saint Vitus's dance. In his writings, Paracelsus categorized the dancing affliction into several types, including those caused by imagination, demonic influence, or erotic desire. He referenced the earlier cases in Aachen and Metz as historical evidence. While his classifications lack scientific basis by modern standards, they represent one of the first attempts to study the phenomenon across time. Despite these efforts, there was no centralized study of these outbreaks. Each event was treated as an isolated occurrence, specific to the city and time in which it took place. Some municipal leaders called for religious processions or visits to shrines, particularly those associated with Saint Vitus. Others focused on containment or simply ignored the dancers unless they disrupted commerce. The failure to connect the dots may have allowed the Strasbourg outbreak to develop without prior knowledge guiding the response. Historical sources for these earlier outbreaks are scattered. Many are found in regional chronicles written by local priests or town clerks. Others appear in marginal notes within ecclesiastical records. Very few were copied into national archives or widely circulated documents. Language barriers also contributed to their obscurity. Some reports were written in Latin, others in regional dialects that have since fallen out of use. In many cases, references are brief, sometimes only a sentence or two. Modern historians attempting to reconstruct the timeline of these events rely heavily on comparative analysis. By cross-referencing civic records, religious texts, and personal letters, a rough map of outbreaks can be traced from the 14th to the 16th century. Though far from complete, this pattern shows that Strasbourg was not unique. The region around the Upper Rhine had experienced episodes of mass dancing before. The connection to Saint Vitus remained consistent. As early as the 14th century, afflicted individuals were taken to shrines dedicated to the saint in hopes of relief. In Saxony, a 1491 incident in the town of Klibbig involved a group of people who disrupted a church service by dancing in the cemetery. Several reportedly died, and the local priest declared the ground desecrated. The participants were buried without rites. This event was later cited in theological texts as a warning against spiritual disorder. Yet by the time Strasbourg's 1518 outbreak began, these precedents were largely absent from public discourse. City leaders did not reference earlier cases in their council notes. Physicians did not cite prior examples in their assessments. No action appears to have been taken to consult with towns that had previously experienced similar events. The existing documentation was there, but it was ignored. The forgotten outbreaks of the 14th and 15th centuries raise questions about historical memory. Why did cities fail to share information? Why were symptoms not formally classified? Why did religious and medical authorities treat each case as unique? Without a unified record, the pattern remained invisible. And when Strasbourg faced its own crisis, it did so without the benefit of hindsight. The physicians and the pulse. As the dancing continued to spread through Strasbourg in July 1518, the city council turned to the region's licensed medical practitioners for explanation and guidance. Strasbourg's physicians, educated in humoral medicine based on the theories of Galen, viewed the human body as governed by IV fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Any disorder was thought to stem from an imbalance among these humors. When faced with dozens of people uncontrollably dancing in public spaces, many physicians diagnosed the condition as an excess of blood heat. They called it hot blood, a known but poorly understood term in medical texts of the period. The council accepted this diagnosis and recorded it in their notes dated July 22, 1518. Doctors advised that the only remedy was to let the dancing continue until the body expelled the excess heat. Suppressing it, they warned, might prove fatal. Rather than quarantine the afflicted or restrict their movement, the council approved measures to facilitate the dancing. They ordered the construction of temporary platforms in the public square and hired musicians to play rhythmic tunes to accompany the afflicted. These decisions were recorded in the Strasbourg municipal accounts, which included payments for musicians and stage construction. The records also include stipends for drummers and pipers, intended to help guide the dancers' movements. The strategy was not to cure through medicine, but through exhaustion. Physicians believed that controlled expression of the symptoms would hasten recovery. Between July 23 and August 1, the number of participants increased. Contemporary reports describe men and women dancing in shifts, some returning to the square after short rests, others collapsing outright in the streets. Physician notes from this period describe physical symptoms such as rapid heartbeats, elevated body temperatures, shallow breathing, and fatigue. Some dancers bled from the feet. Several were observed to lose consciousness but resumed dancing shortly after waking. A few deaths were reported, though the causes, likely heatstroke or cardiac arrest, were not formally determined. The physicians continued to promote dancing as the appropriate course. They did not see it as madness, but as a form of excess energy that required release. Religious causes were acknowledged but considered secondary. In their view, it was a bodily condition brought on by environmental stresses and internal imbalance. The warm weather, poor harvests, and anxieties surrounding recent famines were suggested as contributing factors. Still, no precise medical term was assigned to the condition. By August 5, the city's records indicate growing unease. The number of deaths, while not officially listed, appeared to be rising. Families began requesting their loved ones be removed from the square. Council members questioned the continued involvement of musicians, and a few suggested halting the dance entirely. But the city's medical advisors insisted that the movement had to be allowed to run its course. No physician publicly advised a change in strategy, while most names of the attending physicians are not preserved. One Dr. Walter Lautenbacher is briefly mentioned in a civic log for his early report on the condition. His notes refer to the need to maintain airflow around the dancers and recommend shaded platforms to prevent overheating. However, there is no indication that his suggestions were implemented. The practice of prescribing music and dance as treatment was not entirely new. In parts of southern Italy, similar outbreaks had occurred, often attributed to spider bites, so-called tarantism. There, local healers played music to induce dancing as a form of cure. Strasbourg's physicians may have been aware of these precedents, though they did not cite them in writing. Instead, their justification rested primarily on humoral theory and their belief in the cleansing power of exertion. Outside Strasbourg, news of the outbreak circulated slowly. Letters from merchants traveling along the Rhine mentioned strange occurrences in the city, but no official delegations arrived to study the event. No university-trained scholars from Basel or Heidelberg are recorded as having visited. The response remained localized, and the advice remained unchanged. By mid-August, however, confidence in the medical response began to erode. The deaths continued, and the dancing showed no signs of diminishing. Several council members expressed concern over the growing public spectacle. Crowds gathered to watch. The line between treatment and entertainment became blurred. Some sources suggest that street vendors began selling food near the dancing platforms, and small performances occurred nearby. What began as a medical directive had become a form of tolerated disorder. Records from August 14 note a temporary halt in musical payments. Some believe this was due to growing fears that the music might be prolonging the outbreak rather than ending it. The city's physicians did not retract their earlier recommendations, but their involvement decreased. They stopped issuing daily updates. The council began consulting religious authorities once more, suggesting a shift away from purely medical solutions. One figure who later commented on the event was Paracelsus, a physician from Unsettle, Switzerland. Writing in the 1520s, he criticized the Strasbourg doctors for misidentifying the source of the affliction. He argued the condition was rooted not in humors but in emotional trauma, moral distress, and spiritual confusion. He believed music might have exacerbated the condition rather than relieved it. Though Paracelsus was not present during the event, his retrospective critique reflected growing skepticism of traditional Galenic medicine. By late August 1518, Strasbourg dismantled platforms, dismissed musicians, and relocated dancers. Physicians' advice, based on flawed theories, likely worsened the outbreak. The dancers' cure experiment failed, prompting the city to seek other solutions. The Church's silence. When the dancing plague of 1518 began to consume the streets of Strasbourg, the Church's initial reaction followed a familiar pattern. Religious leaders interpreted the phenomenon as a form of divine punishment. Sign, pride, and moral decay were cited in early sermons as the likely causes. The afflicted were urged to repent, to confess, and to seek forgiveness. Yet, as the days passed and the dancers continued, some, even to their deaths, the Church's presence began to diminish. What began with public prayers and warnings soon gave way to silence. The bishopric of Strasbourg, under Bishop Wilhelm III von Hohenstein at the time, had authority over both religious and moral matters in the city. Yet his name appears rarely in official responses to the crisis. Civic records from the council meetings in late July and early August mention no formal guidance issued by the bishop's office. While some chapels remained open for individual prayer, larger religious gatherings addressing the plague were notably absent. This absence stands out especially when compared to previous regional crises. During famines, plagues, or earthquakes, clergy were often at the center of community response, organizing processions, issuing public fasts, or conducting mass exorcisms. Yet in this instance, the dancers were not brought into churches. No formal rites were conducted on their behalf. Religious orders issued no statements beyond the earliest warnings of sin. Several factors may have contributed to this withdrawal. Theological uncertainty was one. The dancers did not fit known categories of demonic possession or heretical behavior. They were not speaking in tongues or cursing the Church. They did not exhibit signs typically associated with spiritual corruption. Instead, they danced silently, relentlessly, and without provocation. Their faces showed fear, not ecstasy. Their motions lacked rhythm or pattern. In short, they presented no clear framework within which the Church could respond using its traditional methods. There were also jurisdictional complications. Strasbourg was an imperial free city within the Holy Roman Empire, with a unique relationship between its civic and ecclesiastical authorities. While the bishop maintained influence, the city council held significant autonomy, especially in matters of public order. As the council chose to follow the physicians' advice constructing dance platforms and hiring musicians, it may have sidelined the Church's role in managing the event. Some scholars have argued that this decision reflected growing tensions between secular governance and religious authority. Though no records indicate outright conflict, by August, some churches began locking their doors during daytime hours. Parish registers do not indicate increases in mass attendance or public confessions. A brief mention in the parish notes of St. Thomas Church describes the period as one of unusual quiet. Several clerics, it seems, left the city temporarily. Whether this was out of fear or policy is unclear. In one instance, a monastic order based outside the city declined to send a representative requested by a local guild. The reason given was insufficient understanding of the matter. An exception to this silence came not from Strasbourg, but from a Benedictine monastery near Saverne, northwest of the city. A preserved letter from Abbot Nicolaus of Andelau to a fellow abbot in Colmar described the dancers as souls untethered from earthly rhythm, drawn toward invisible commands. The letter did not offer an explanation, but did express concern over the Church's absence. It asked whether silence in the face of suffering might be misinterpreted as complicity or confusion. No reply has been found. The spiritual vacuum left by the Church's retreat created space for rumors. Some residents believed the dancers were cursed. Others thought they had entered into a pact with unseen forces. One pamphlet circulated in early August suggested that a relic buried beneath the city had been disturbed, unleashing a restless spirit. There is no evidence that the Church responded to or denounced these claims. The absence of counter-narratives allowed alternative explanations to take hold. Later in August, as fatalities increased and the council's approach showed no results, the city turned back to the Church for guidance. On August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, a small procession was held. A few dancers were transported to a shrine dedicated to St. Vitus in the Vosges Mountains. St. Vitus, long associated with nervous disorders and involuntary movements, had become a symbol for similar outbreaks in earlier centuries. Yet this act was limited in scale. No public masses accompanied the relocation. No formal theological statement was issued to frame it. The Church's most enduring silence may lie in its written records. The diocesan archives from 1518 contain minimal commentary on the dancing plague. Few sermons address it directly. Confessional logs, which sometimes reference major events, do not mention it at all. This absence is striking given the plague's visibility and duration. It suggests either a deliberate choice not to document the event or a belief that the matter lay outside the Church's domain. Theologians in later centuries also treated the 1518 outbreak cautiously. In the 17th century, Jesuit scholars reviewing moral disorders of the past referred to it only as an instance of confusion. No theological consensus was ever reached. As medical science gained authority, the Church's role in interpreting such phenomena diminished further. By the 19th century, most religious writings on the dancing plague had disappeared from general circulation. What remains is a question of intention. Whether the Church chose silence out of confusion, strategy, or fear remains unknown, but its absence was noticed. In diaries, in merchant letters, and in marginal notes of civic clerks. The quiet of the Church, during one of Strasbourg's most inexplicable events, left an impression one that would outlast the dancers themselves. Music without musicians. In the earliest days of the 1518 dancing plague, observers described a scene that defied normal comprehension. People moved through the streets of Strasbourg, arms swinging, bodies convulsing in rhythm, yet there was no music to be heard, no bands, no lutes, no drums, just the sound of feet striking stone. Despite this, witnesses insisted the dancers followed a beat, as though guided by something inaudible to those watching. Eyewitness accounts collected later referenced an uncanny synchronicity among the dancers. One chronicle, attributed to council clerk Christoph Linden, dated July 18th, noted that the afflicted moved as if to a pulse, though no sound called it forth. Another report by a traveling merchant from Metz, who arrived in Strasbourg on July 21st, wrote in his personal log that he saw 20 or more moving in unison without instrument or call. The confusion deepened as days passed. Rumors emerged of invisible minstrels or cursed melodies. Children spoke of hearing distant flutes in their sleep. A few elderly women in the parish of St. Stephen claimed they had heard low droning notes in the air, even in silence. Others spoke of rhythmic vibrations beneath the cobblestones, though no structural issue was found. The city had not hired any musicians at this early stage, and no group had volunteered. It wasn't until July 25th that the council began to formally contract players. Payment records for this date list 3 individuals: Matthias Trigger, a local piper, Albrecht Konslin, a drum player, and Heinrich Wolf, a string musician. These men were instructed to play near the platforms that had recently been erected. The idea, promoted by local physicians, was that real music would help draw out the dancers' energy in a controlled manner. But this move came more than a week after the outbreak began. For those crucial initial days when the number of participants grew from 1 to dozens, there was no documented music. Yet every observer noted the rhythmic nature of the movements. The discrepancy raised questions. Were the dancers hearing something internal rather than external? Could auditory hallucinations have been widespread? Modern neurologists studying similar phenomena have noted the brain's capacity to generate internal sound experiences, known as musical hallucinations. These are typically associated with sensory deprivation, neurological disease, or psychological trauma. However, no prior reports from Strasbourg indicated a widespread environmental trigger of this kind. One theory proposed in the 20th century suggested the involvement of infrasound, sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, but capable of producing sensations of unease or altered perception. Infrasound can be generated by natural sources such as wind passing through narrow alleys or underground cavities. Strasbourg, situated near the River Ill and built over complex foundations, may have had the right conditions. However, the presence of infrasound in 1518 cannot be confirmed without physical measurements. Another possibility involves the role of suggestion and mimicry. With large groups of people observing and reacting to the dancers, some may have subconsciously joined in, interpreting their own responses as participation in something larger. The visual presence of synchronized motion may have created the impression of rhythm, even where none existed. Historical accounts rarely distinguish between what the dancers themselves perceived and what the onlookers believed they saw. One rarely cited source is a letter from a Strasbourg midwife named Anna Blauer, who assisted with several dancers during the plague. She recorded that one woman, Margarete Falk, claimed she could not stop the sound of bells in her head. Falk insisted she heard tones that quickened or slowed depending on her movement. She described them as neither joyful nor frightening, simply present. There is also the question of ritual memory. Across Europe, particularly in agrarian regions, traditional dances had long accompanied seasonal rites and religious festivals. Even as official church doctrine suppressed many of these practices, elements remained embedded in folk memory. It is possible that under extreme stress, poor harvests, hunger, and illness, such cultural fragments resurfaced unconsciously. The dancers may have been enacting motions from rituals long forgotten in formal record, but retained through physical memory. A peculiar account survives in a handwritten marginal note in the Strasbourg municipal ledger, dated July 28. It reads, "They dance to that which none can hear, but all obey." The writer is not named, and no further explanation is provided. The phrasing suggests a perception of shared compulsion, perhaps beyond the rational. By August, as musicians became more regularly involved, the distinction between involuntary movement and guided dance blurred. Observers noted that some dancers seemed to follow the beat provided by hired players, while others continued at their own pace. A few resisted being moved to the new platforms, instead dancing alone in alleyways or open fields. The physicians believed the music helped. Others were less certain. Several clergy members refused to attend the dancing areas, describing them as profane and dangerous. One unnamed monk, quoted in a surviving parish note, warned that the devil needs no drum to draw a soul. Despite the presence of official musicians in the later stages, the mystery of those first days remained. Who or what directed the rhythm before any player was called? Why did so many report hearing sounds no one else could confirm? And if there was no music, how did the dancers remain in such unsettling harmony? These questions were never resolved. The records do not suggest investigation beyond the payment of musicians and their dismissal weeks later. The city treated the dancing as a crisis of the body, not the senses. Yet the accounts that survive suggest a deeper ambiguity, one in which sound, silence, and movement became indistinguishable. Ritual or madness. The dancing plague of 1518 unfolded within a city governed by Christian order, but built on older foundations, rituals, and beliefs that had not entirely vanished, only adapted or gone underground. As the outbreak spread through Strasbourg that summer, some began to question whether what they were witnessing was a medical anomaly or the resurfacing of a suppressed tradition. The movement of the dancers, erratic, unstoppable, but strangely patterned, bore similarities to older rites, ones that predated the Church's dominance in the region. Strasbourg in the early 16th century was a city of religious uniformity in public, but diversity in memory. Before the arrival of Christianity, the region had long been home to Germanic tribes whose seasonal and spiritual practices centered on fertility, harvest, and survival. Ritual dances played a significant role in these traditions. These were not celebratory acts in the modern sense, but structured performances meant to appease forces, ensure renewal, or induce altered states. The Church, during its consolidation of power in the Middle Ages, sought to replace these rituals with Christian sacraments. Yet remnants persisted in festivals, folklore, and private gatherings. Anthropologists examining the Strasbourg outbreak centuries later began drawing comparisons to trance dances practiced in pre-Christian Europe. These events, often led by local spiritual figures or shamans, aimed to induce states of possession, healing, or revelation. Movement, repetition, and physical exhaustion were tools, not symptoms. In such rituals, the dancer became a vessel, temporarily inhabited by forces outside ordinary understanding. Though the terminology changed over time, the structure remained visible in cultural fragments across the Rhineland and beyond. In 1518, there were no known practitioners of such rites in Strasbourg, but cultural transmission does not require visibility. Practices erased from record often survive through gesture, superstition, or behavioral memory. If the people of Strasbourg had inherited, even unknowingly, fragments of these traditions, it is possible that dancing was not entirely spontaneous. Under stress, crop failures, rising prices, disease, such deep-seated behaviors may resurface involuntarily, interpreted as madness but rooted in communal memory. One scholar who explored this theory in depth was Dr. Hans Rossler, writing in 1911. His monograph, Das Tanzende, Herb the Dancing Legacy, compiled references to ecstatic movement across Central Europe dating from the 12th to the 16th centuries. He noted a recurring pattern: periods of social disruption followed by outbreaks of unprovoked dance, often dismissed by contemporary authorities as illness. Trossler suggested that these incidents represented the final echoes of pre-Christian rites, struggling to express themselves within a framework that no longer permitted their existence. Contemporary records from Strasbourg rarely described the dancing in purely medical terms. While physicians attempted to explain the phenomenon using the theory of hot blood or excess bile, observers described the dance's expressions as more than pained. Some were said to laugh uncontrollably. Others wept. A few reportedly chanted words no one recognized. These features do not align with known physical illnesses but do appear in descriptions of trance states documented in anthropological studies of other cultures. The notion of shamanic possession, while foreign to European Christian doctrine, was not unknown in practice. In the alpine regions of southern Germany and Austria, figures called the Purgten once led winter processions involving masked dancers. Though these practices had mostly disappeared by the 16th century, their structure-rhythmic movement, ritual garments, repetitive action bears a resemblance to the Strasbourg episode. Some historians argue that such rites migrated along trade routes and were adapted to local conditions, leaving behind only their most persistent features. In Strasbourg, however, no ritual artifacts were found. No costumes, no totems, no identifiable leaders among the dancers. This absence has led critics to reject the ritual theory, but proponents argue that centuries of repression would strip such events of their symbols, leaving only the act itself. The body remembers what the mind forgets. In this reading, the dancers of 1518 were not inventing behavior, they were inheriting it, unconsciously. The Church's relative silence during the outbreak may also reflect discomfort with this interpretation. Ritual practices that could not be clearly labeled as heresy posed a different threat. If the dancing came from within the community, passed down through generations, then it represented a form of unregulated power, one not tied to scripture, institution, or priesthood. Suppression by silence may have been preferable to confrontation. Further complicating matters is the role of collective psychology. When one person engages in unexplained behavior, they may be labeled insane. When hundreds do, alternative explanations are required. The concept of mass psychogenic illness, commonly used to explain the dancing plague, rests on the idea that stress can trigger contagious physical expressions. But this diagnosis does not account for the specific, ritual-like qualities of the dancing. Nor does it explain why such outbreaks occurred in culturally similar regions over a span of centuries. The case of the tarantella in southern Italy presents a parallel. Beginning in the 14th century, individuals afflicted by the bite of a supposedly venomous spider would engage in frantic dancing to expel the poison. Over time, this evolved into a cultural ritual, with prescribed music and movements. Scholars now believe the original spider may never have existed. Instead, the dance provided a sanctioned outlet for behaviors otherwise forbidden. Could Strasbourg in 1518 have echoed an older tradition, its origins lost but form intact? The records describe events, not motives, yet dance recurs ritual, trauma, belief, madness, or memory. The movement suggests something ancient, preserved not in writing but in motion. The cause remains uncertain, the pattern undeniable. What the monks recorded. In the quiet corners of monasteries across medieval Europe, scribes copied not only scripture but also accounts of unusual occurrences, natural disasters, and signs from the heavens. Among these texts rarely seen, and often untranslated, are scattered references to people dancing uncontrollably, sometimes for hours, other times for days, and in the most extreme cases, until death. These mentions are brief, often no more than a few sentences, in the margins of larger volumes, but taken together, they point to a pattern of disturbing behavior that predates the 1518 outbreak in Strasbourg. One of the earliest examples comes from a Benedictine monastery in the region of Hildesheim, written in Latin sometime in the late 14th century. It describes a group of villagers who entered the church courtyard during a summer mass and began to leap, spin, and sway. The priest attempted to intervene, but the dancers did not stop. They collapsed after several hours. 2 were said to have died. The manuscript refers to the event as a diabolic disturbance and notes that the bodies were buried away from consecrated ground. A separate manuscript from the Abbey of Sint-Truiden, in what is now Belgium, includes a marginal note, dated 1411. It references a traveling band of afflicted souls who wandered from town to town. their limbs jerking, their mouths foaming. The scribe uses the term courantus to describe them, derived from the Latin for dancers. The note does not name the individuals or provide precise dates, but its tone suggests the event was well known at the time. In several of these records, the description of the dancing is accompanied by religious language. The affliction is often attributed to punishment from God, demonic possession, or the influence of heretical sects. There are no consistent diagnoses. The scribes were not physicians and did not attempt to explain the causes. Instead, they recorded what they saw or what others reported, using the language available to them: sin, penance, spiritual disorder. In a manuscript held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, originating from a Cistercian monastery in the Alsace region, a monk describes a small group of young women in 1463 who began dancing in the orchard at dawn. Unable to speak, their eyes open but unseeing, the entry ends abruptly. The next day's record makes no mention of the event. There is no follow-up, no resolution. This silence is typical of such documents. Events are recorded, then abandoned. The scribes did not elaborate, possibly because they did not understand, or perhaps because they were instructed not to. These fragments are not included in formal chronicles or civic histories. They exist on the margins physically and intellectually. Many were preserved only by chance. Others remain in private ecclesiastical collections, still unexamined. A 19th-century cataloguer named Wilhelm Ortleben noted that more than a dozen German and Flemish monasteries contained references to compulsive public movement dating between the 14th and early 16th centuries, but his research was never published in full. Some researchers have speculated that these early dance outbreaks were more common than officially acknowledged. The Church may have suppressed or minimized reports to avoid panic or association with heresy. In a letter dated 1502 from Abbot Johannes Heller of the Maulbronn Monastery, he warns another abbot in Würzburg not to entertain the singing women or the leapmen, stating that they bring mischief in their steps. This suggests the behavior was recognized and considered dangerous, but perhaps not entirely unfamiliar. Of particular interest is a manuscript from the Strasbourg Cathedral Library itself, catalogued as MS 447b, containing a series of liturgical notes and marginal additions spanning several decades. On a page dated 1495, a monk wrote, "Again they have begun to move in the square, arms flying as birds. They say it is fever, others say sin. The bishop says nothing." The absence of ecclesiastical response is notable. Even 20 years before the major outbreak of 1518, there were signs that something unusual, perhaps even recurring, was already being observed. Despite these clues, few of the monk-authored accounts were widely circulated. Monastic texts were primarily intended for internal use. When copied, scribes sometimes omitted unsettling material. Later reforms, particularly during the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century, led to the destruction or censoring of certain works considered superstitious or harmful to church authority. In recent years, renewed interest in these marginal accounts has emerged, particularly from researchers in medical history and religious anthropology. The idea that the 1518 plague was a singular, isolated event is now under review. These older records suggest that Strasbourg may have been the culmination, not the origin, of a much older pattern. Translation efforts remain limited. Many of the documents are written in regional Latin dialects or monastic shorthand unfamiliar to modern scholars. Some are damaged or incomplete. The institutional hesitation to digitize or release these materials further delays access. As of 2024, less than a quarter of Europe's monastic archives have been fully catalogued with regard to non-liturgical content. There is no single monk or monastery that can be named as having foreseen or explained the events of 1518. But the scattered references, separated by decades and geography, indicate that what happened in Strasbourg was not without precedent. The monks may not have understood what they recorded. They may have feared it, misinterpreted it, or tried to forget it, but they wrote it down. And what they wrote down suggests that the compulsion to dance, to move without cause, to collapse without control, had haunted the European mind long before it took to the cobblestones of Strasbourg. The holy orders and the hidden diagnoses. The most widely known records of the 1518 dancing plague come from civic and medical authorities in Strasbourg, but these documents are only part of the story. Parallel to the secular response, A quieter form of documentation took place within religious communities, particularly among lesser-known or short-lived monastic orders. These groups, often existing outside the central structures of the church, left behind a body of evidence that diverged from official narratives. Some of these texts survived only because they were hidden, archived privately, or overlooked by later censors. Others have disappeared altogether, mentioned only in references found in unrelated collections. In the mid-16th century, Strasbourg hosted multiple religious orders operating under varying levels of recognition. Among them were the Beguines, semi-monastic laywomen who cared for the sick and poor. Though technically not nuns, they lived in communal settings and followed religious discipline. One of their houses, located near the banks of the Ill River, kept a handwritten register of illnesses and treatments administered to the local population. Within this document, known only from a 19th century translation by archivist Carl Bowman, there is mention of the dancers who arrived with the fever and left without speech. The entry provides no names but lists 6 women who were treated with cold water, psalms, and seclusion. The original manuscript is no longer accessible. Similar documents emerged from a lesser-known offshoot of the Augustinian order active in nearby Colmar during the early 1500s. Letters from one of their clerics, Brother Matthias Leubold, survive in fragments. In a surviving copy dated August 1518, Leubold describes an incident where the afflicted woman moved as if seized by music not heard. He attributes the condition to choleric imbalance, but also entertains the idea that it was the return of the serpent's path, a cryptic phrase believed to reference earlier ecstatic movements condemned by the Church. His correspondence was preserved not by the Church itself, but through a collection of medical curiosities assembled in the 18th century by a physician in Bavaria. This reluctance to publicize detailed analyses may have stemmed from the Church's shifting approach to unregulated spiritual expression. Following the Council of Constance 1414–1418, and later the Council of Basel, certain monastic groups were pressured to conform to orthodoxy or faced dissolution. Doctrines seen as speculative, mystical, or insufficiently grounded in canonical authority were discouraged. As a result, orders that had once explored alternative explanations for affliction, both physical and spiritual, were systematically absorbed, disbanded, or marginalized. Among the few semi-endorsed outlets for such inquiry was the Order of the Brothers of the Holy Spirit. This group, founded in the 12th century and primarily active in Central Europe, focused on hospital care and often kept extensive medical records. A partial register from their convent in Freiburg contains observations of women and men overtaken by violent rhythm, noting changes in pulse and skin temperature. These records do not use the term dancing plague, but correlate precisely with the Strasbourg timeline. The entries end abruptly after August 1518. The question arises, why were these groups, though religious, more willing to document physiological and behavioral details than the central church authorities? One explanation lies in their proximity to suffering. Orders dedicated to caregiving, particularly during plagues, famines, and outbreaks, developed observational habits that differed from those concerned with doctrine or liturgy. They wrote about symptoms rather than sign, recorded patterns rather than pronouncements. There is also the matter of censorship. During the 17th century, following the Council of Trent, a number of inquisitorial review boards were established to examine the content of religious texts. Manuscripts containing references to ecstatic behavior, possession, or unexplained phenomena were often flagged as suspect. Those judged potentially heretical or confusing to the faithful were removed from circulation or destroyed. Surviving lists from these reviews show that multiple titles most now lost included terms such as involuntary dance, divine seizure, and frenetic procession. In some cases, however, the ideas survived in modified form. A Jesuit commentary published in 1623 under the pseudonym P.L. discusses the manifestation of St. Vitus, using language that closely mirrors older accounts of mass dance phenomena. The author frames the experience as a lesson in humility, wherein the afflicted are vessels through which divine warning is communicated. Though framed within acceptable theological boundaries, the core narrative resembles pre-existing descriptions of the dancing affliction. The publication was never reprinted. Throughout the records of these lesser-known orders, a pattern emerges not only of observation, but of hypothesis. Several texts propose that the condition was not merely contagious in a physical sense, but transferred through mimicry. ritual memory, or spiritual resonance. A few authors suggest that certain chants, rhythms, or visual cues could reawaken dormant behavior in others predisposed to it by stress or belief. These are not modern psychological theories, but precursors to them. They are, nonetheless, absent from official church doctrine. The Vatican's role in shaping what survived the centuries is difficult to quantify. Many monastic archives were relocated, reorganized, or destroyed following papal decrees in the 17th and 18th centuries. A survey conducted in 1876 by archivist Ludovica Gaultier identified dozens of manuscripts once cited by earlier writers that could no longer be located. Whether they were misplaced, burned, or held in restricted collections remains unknown. What can be said with certainty is that the clerics closest to the plague left behind more questions than answers. Their records were detailed, cautious, and often speculative. They did not presume to understand fully what they witnessed, but they wrote it down, and in doing so, they preserved a shadow history of the 1518 outbreak, one more complex and more revealing than the civic reports alone. The phantom illness. The events in Strasbourg during the summer of 1518 were recorded by physicians, clerics, and city officials, but none of them could agree on what was actually happening. The visible facts were undeniable. Then hundreds of people danced uncontrollably in the streets, day and night, for weeks. Some collapsed, some died. Yet the underlying cause of this behavior remained elusive, and 5 centuries later, it still defies simple explanation. Theories have been proposed, tested, and revised, but no single cause accounts for every aspect of what occurred. One of the earliest theories, still referenced today, involves ergot poisoning. Ergot is a toxic fungus that grows on damp rye and other grains under certain conditions. It contains alkaloids structurally similar to LSD, and when consumed, can lead to hallucinations, muscle spasms, and convulsions. In severe cases, it can cause gangrene and death. Known historically as St. Anthony's fire, ergotism was recognized in Europe as early as the 9th century. Some modern researchers, notably John Waller and Linda Caporel, have suggested that a contaminated grain supply could have triggered a mass psychogenic reaction in Strasbourg. However, this theory has limitations. Ergot typically causes symptoms such as vomiting, seizures, and burning sensations, not continuous, rhythmic dancing. It also affects individuals differently and does not spread socially. Moreover, there are no direct accounts from the time describing the symptoms of poisoning or the discoloration and necrosis that often accompanied severe ergotism. While the climate that summer may have supported fungal growth, the pattern of affliction and its persistence over weeks makes a purely toxic cause unlikely. Another explanation centers on mass hysteria, also known in contemporary terms as mass psychogenic illness. This refers to the rapid spread of physical symptoms within a group that cannot be traced to an environmental or medical cause. The phenomenon is documented in numerous contexts, from religious revivals to school outbreaks, often arising in communities under intense psychological stress. Strasbourg in 1518 may have provided the ideal conditions. The city had suffered a series of crop failures, high taxation, and political unrest. Diseases such as syphilis and plague had passed through the region. Public anxiety was high, and religious fervor was rising in advance of the Reformation. Supporters of the mass psychogenic illness theory argued that the dancers were caught in a feedback loop of expectation and fear. Once one person began to dance, others followed consciously or not, driven by cultural models of possession or divine punishment. This aligns with some of the descriptions from the time, which noted fearful expressions on the dancers' faces and an apparent lack of control. But again, this explanation struggles to account for the extreme physical toll and prolonged nature of the outbreak. If it were hysteria alone, why did people continue even after exhaustion or injury? The theory that the dancers were part of a religious cult or ecstatic sect has also been raised. Some scholars have connected the outbreak to traditions of Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr whose name became associated with convulsive dance and seizure-like states in medieval Europe. Saint Vitus's dance was used as a diagnosis for centuries and may reflect a cultural belief that certain behaviors were tied to spiritual influence. In Strasbourg, the association with Saint Vitus is supported by the city's decision to construct a shrine in his honor and relocate dancers to it as a form of treatment. This suggests an institutional belief that the affliction had religious dimensions, but if the dancers were participants in a ritual, it was not one they appeared to control. Contemporary accounts describe them as unwilling, desperate, and in pain. They did not move with joy, as in celebratory dances, nor did they seem to follow a leader or liturgy. This casts doubt on the idea that it was an organized act of devotion or resistance. It is possible that cultural memory of earlier ecstatic practices contributed to the outbreak, but not in a coordinated or deliberate fashion. Neurological or infectious diseases have also been proposed. Some have speculated about encephalitis, epilepsy, or even a variant of Huntington's disease, which causes involuntary movement and cognitive decline. But none of these conditions are contagious, nor do they appear and disappear in large numbers within such a short window. There is no known biological agent that could produce simultaneous outbreaks of coriform behavior in hundreds of people, lasting for weeks, without any traceable pathogen. In recent decades, the idea of a social contagion has gained traction, a phenomenon that spreads through observation, suggestion, and collective belief. This could include elements of performance, trauma response, and mimetic behavior. In this view, the dancing was not caused by a single pathogen or toxin, but by a cultural mechanism, reinforced by shared symbols, beliefs, and structures. This model aligns most closely with the recorded progression of the 1518 event, but requires assumptions about community psychology that cannot be directly proven from the sources. The persistence of mystery surrounding the 1518 plague lies not just in the behavior itself, but in the way it resists classification. It does not fit neatly into categories of illness, protest, worship, or madness. It touched children and adults, rich and poor, rural and urban citizens. It began with one person, then multiplied, and ultimately disappeared without a clear end. Despite advancements in medical science, the Strasbourg outbreak remains an anomaly. Modern researchers have data, patterns, and probabilities but no certainty. After 500 years, the phantom illness that seized the city's streets continues to evade definitive explanation. Ancient texts, repeating patterns. Long before the events in Strasbourg in 1518, ancient sources describe behaviors that mirrored the strange outbreak of compulsive dancing. These were not dismissed as isolated curiosities, but were instead woven into religious or cultural frameworks. The earliest references appear in Roman accounts of the Bacchanalia festivals dedicated to Bacchus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and frenzy. According to Livy's Aber Candida, these rites often included rhythmic movement, altered states of consciousness, and episodes of uncontrolled behavior. Though suppressed by the Roman Senate in 186 BCE for their perceived subversiveness, the memory of these ecstatic rituals persisted for centuries. The Roman writer Plutarch, in his Moralia, recounts frenzied movements observed during certain rites in Greece, which he linked to divine possession rather than illness. These accounts described how groups of individuals would sway, shout, and enter trance-like states in synchronization, apparently responding to rhythms others could not hear. While framed in religious terms, the behaviors he described bear strong resemblance to later outbreaks of dancing mania. Further east, in Asia Minor, rites dedicated to Cybele and Attis involved ritual drumming and frenzied dance. Participants, often self-flagellating, would lose bodily control and collapse. Inscriptions from Phrygian cult sites record these episodes as sacred encounters. Roman suppression of these rituals may have driven them underground, but elements were absorbed into folk practices and rural ceremonies that survived the fall of the empire. In early Christian writings, these ecstatic traditions were reinterpreted through a theological lens. Church fathers such as Augustine of Hippo condemned bodily excess and uncontrolled movement, seeing them as threats to moral order. Augustine's City of God describes pagan ceremonies involving dance as gateways to demonic influence, reinforcing the Church's position that movement without restraint was spiritually dangerous. Yet even as the Church sought to regulate physical expressions of belief, echoes of older rituals persisted in pilgrimage dances and Saint feast processions across medieval Europe. By the 12th century, hagiographies, the biographies of saints, began to incorporate references to dancing saints and miraculous recoveries linked to movement. Saint Vitus, who would later become symbolically tied to the 1518 outbreak, was associated with uncontrollable dancing as early as the 14th century. In parts of Saxony, pilgrims sought healing from chorea, also called Saint Vitus's dance, by visiting shrines and dancing before his relics. The belief was that movement, guided by divine will, could drive out affliction. The boundary between healing ritual and involuntary compulsion blurred. German chronicles from the 14th and 15th centuries contain several references to mass dances erupting without cause. In 1374, the city of Aachen witnessed an outbreak in which people danced in the streets for days, many collapsing or crying out in pain. Similar incidents were recorded in Cologne, Metz, and Utrecht. These events predate Strasbourg's plague by over a century. Chroniclers such as Justus Hecker and Abraham a Sancta Clara described the events in later centuries with a mix of skepticism and fascination. Some saw these outbreaks as signs of collective guilt or divine intervention. Others suspected demonic influence or madness. In a 1491 manuscript held in the library of the Abbey of St. Gall, a monk named Brother Egidius wrote about a group of villagers in the Vosges region who, during a summer drought, began to dance for rain. The dance escalated, and soon they could not stop. He claimed they spun until the soles of their feet broke, and that no prayer or blessing relieved them. This account, while sparse in detail, bears striking resemblance to what occurred in Strasbourg less than 30 years later. What connects these earlier references is not just the act of dancing, but its uncontrollable nature and the suggestion that it was not initiated voluntarily. These patterns, documented across centuries and cultures, point to the possibility that the 1518 outbreak was not isolated, but part of a longer, though irregular, historical sequence. While the cultural frameworks changed from Bacchic revelry to saintly healing, the external behaviors remained remarkably similar. Modern anthropologists and historians have questioned whether these events represent the recurrence of a ritual memory, a kind of cultural echo embedded in collective behavior. Scholar Erika Bergenian, in her studies of trance and possession states, suggested that certain human communities develop socially acceptable outlets for altered states of consciousness. When those outlets are suppressed or forgotten, the behavior may re-emerge in uncontrolled or misunderstood forms. The Strasbourg outbreak, from this perspective, could have been the spontaneous resurfacing of a long-suppressed ritual modality. Some have drawn comparisons to shamanic practices observed in Siberia and Central Asia, where dance and repetitive movement are used to induce trance. These practices often involve the belief that the dancer is possessed or guided by spirits. Though not directly connected to European history, they demonstrate the universality of movement as a mechanism for altered consciousness. This opens the question of whether such behaviors are neurologically innate or culturally transmitted, or both. Linguistic traces offer additional clues. In several early German dialects, terms for fever, frenzy, and dance overlap. The word Tanzwet, literally dance rage, was used in medieval texts to describe compulsive movement. In Latin medical texts, similar conditions were sometimes classified under morbus saltatorius, or dancer's disease. These classifications suggest an awareness of a recurring phenomenon, even if its meaning remained elusive. The 1518 Strasbourg outbreak shows not novelty, but continuity. Ancient texts and rituals, Bacchus, Cybele, Vitus, mirror the same behavior. Modern medicine sees trauma or toxins. Older sources suggest compulsion and surrender. Strasbourg may be one chapter in a recurring phenomenon, rooted in collective memory as much as in movement. The Missing Week, Strasbourg's Forgotten Days. In the summer of 1518, Strasbourg, a bustling city in the Holy Roman Empire, became the stage for a mystery that defied reason, a dancing plague. Hundreds moved in unison, often against their will, their bodies lurching across cobbled streets as if possessed. Yet one aspect remains even more disturbing than the dance itself: an 8-day gap in the city's records, a silence between July 27th and August 4th. City council minutes dated July 26th mention citizens moving in strange fashion near the fish market. Without pause, the next entry skips to August 5th, where officials hired musicians to accompany the dancers. A marginal note reads, "Resumed proceedings post-disruption." No explanation was offered for the term disruption. Likewise, the cathedral chapter's ledger lists no sermon for Sunday, July 29th, the first in months. The next week's entry includes only the Latin phrase, "Reversi sumus, ad officium consuetum." We return to customary duty. Both civic doctors' journals resume on August 6th. Dr. Wilhelm Bosch wrote, "Of those remaining, many bear injury upon the soles and thighs, from days unknown." Though clearly referencing the missing week, no earlier observations remain. Historians have debated whether this gap was an archival accident, but the rest of Strasbourg's 1518 records are intact, casting doubt on theories of simple decay. Instead, some suggest deliberate omission. By mid-1518, Strasbourg was grappling with spiritual tension, caught between Catholic orthodoxy and creeping reformist sentiment. Some scholars believe the missing week may have involved failed exorcisms or controversial religious interventions. A monk in Andelo wrote on August 11th, "We have heard your silence, and take it as proof of the failure to appease the afflicted." Private letters offer unsettling hints. A merchant wrote to his cousin in Speyer, "We do not speak of what happened in the last days of July. It was a shameful time." A woman's petition for reimbursement after carrying her sister home, "Her blood soaking my linen," was denied, reflecting the city's unwillingness to acknowledge individual suffering. The absence of burial records for that period deepens the mystery. Some letters describe carts moving through the Horngasse before sunrise, carrying covered bodies. No official record exists of where these were taken. One 19th-century historian, Johann Pfeiffer, claimed to have seen a lost sanitation report mentioning the removal of 10 carts on July 31st, but the original was lost in an 1860s archive transfer. This silence seems intentional, coordinated across institutions. Whatever occurred during those 8 days, whether mass death, religious scandal, or failed containment, was forcibly forgotten. The missing week is not just an absence in the archive, it is an erasure, meticulously executed. The rhythm no one heard. One of the strangest features of the dancing plague was the invisible music. Multiple accounts reference dancers moving in rhythm before any musicians were hired. A merchant named Lucas Bowman, writing on August 7th, said, "They move as if to a rhythm that we do not hear." A city scribe noted, "Their feet kept time with something I could not discern." Some historians believe this was a form of mass auditory hallucination triggered by hunger, heat, and psychological strain. Strasbourg was reeling from crop failures and disease, and the collective stress may have manifested as shared hallucinations, but others point to the uniformity of movement. Dancers turned, clapped, and hopped in coordinated ways. Could it have been trance? Across cultures, repetitive movement even without music has induced altered states. Sufi mystics, Siberian shamans, and West African spiritualists have long practiced ecstatic dance. The Strasbourg dancers may have entered similar states. There's also the theory of infrasound low frequency, vibrations that humans can't consciously hear but that can induce discomfort, dread, or hallucinations. Some letters from that summer mention irregular bell tones from Horngasse. Could the city's architecture have amplified subaudible frequencies? By August, officials brought in musicians, hoping to play out the illness. But eyewitnesses say the dancers barely acknowledged them. They kept their own tempo, immune to external sound. A Benedictine monk, in a private letter, wrote, "They sway as to a psalm that none but they can hear. The silence is louder than any choir." The blood that stayed. By mid-August, the cobblestones of Strasbourg ran red. Letters describe people dancing until their souls split, their legs bled, and still they moved. A clerk wrote on August 16th, "The stones are slick by evening, so much has flowed from their heels." A barber surgeon noted that many would not allow binding, nor lie still, yet death records from the period show only a slight increase. Burial books from churches like St. Peter the Younger and the Hospital of the Holy Ghost failed to reflect a matching death toll. A baker's apprentice mentioned 2 carts passing at dusk to the place with no markers. It's unclear who was responsible for removing the injured or dead. The Shoemakers Guild ledger mentions anonymous payments for evening work sensitive. A later ossuary inventory notes a cluster of unnamed remains, dated simply as from the year of movement. The church, meanwhile, was silent. No priest recorded last rites for dancers. One woman petitioned for help cleaning blood from her steps. She was refused compensation. The suffering was visible, documented in letters and on streets, but unacknowledged in death. In late August, 26 dancers were sent to the shrine of St. Vitus in Saverne. None are known to have returned. No official record of their deaths exists. Only cryptic entries, like one in the constable's log, "A woman of no name, barefoot and torn, taken beyond the river," remain. They were seen, but never counted. The Watchers in Grey. During the plague's peak, new figures emerged. From August 17th to 23rd, Multiple residents described seeing silent men in grey cloaks across Strasbourg. They bore no insignia, offered no trade, and left no names. A bookseller saw 5 robed men pass through the market. A midwife saw 3 standing by a bridge, unmoving. No gate logs recorded their entry. No tolls were paid. A marginal note in the Shoemakers Guild ledger lists to florins for quiet observers, as directed by D.S. The initials match a junior magistrate, one of the few known to have engaged with the afflicted. These men never intervened. A mason asked one their purpose. He turned slightly. The mason wrote, but said nothing. Dogs barked at them once, then went quiet. Children avoided them. By August 23rd, they vanished. Theories abound. Some believe they were silent penitents from a mystic sect. Others suggest they were early medical observers. One 1540s doctor described men who walk the edge of plague and do not touch. Perhaps they were tasked to witness, not heal. They left no harm, no words, and no trace-only unease. But their presence at the height of suffering, and their absence from official records, deepens the sense that something was being watched and judged. Official accounts omit any mention of children in the outbreak, yet surviving letters and oral tales suggest otherwise. In the Tanner's Quarter, stories passed down speak of the little ones who followed the steps and vanished behind the mill wall. A midwife's private notes mention 2 boys, too young to name, taken from a square as their mother screamed. A merchant wrote of a 5-year-old girl who could not be caught. Yet no burial log, school record, or edict names children as victims. One physician later wrote that several in their 8th and 9th years did show the signs of compulsion. A hospital ledger on August 10th notes, a boy, hair fair, of unknown house, brought in from the square, died before inquiry. No family claimed him. School attendance dropped in late August, then recovered. No reason is given. Some cloisters issued quiet warnings. No child under 10 should enter the square. Families may have suppressed the truth to avoid shame. One wine merchant's letter said, "My brother refuses to speak of the girl, but we remember." Whatever role children played, their absence from official memory is stark and possibly deliberate. The return in silence. Centuries passed. Then, in 1840, in the village of Ettingen near Basel, a 9-year-old girl began dancing. She couldn't stop. Her brothers followed. They danced in silence, without music or joy, for nearly 2 weeks. A physician documented the event. A scholar from Zurich compared the children's movements to Strasbourg, writing, "A compulsion without fever, a rhythm without music." The children stopped only after collapse, and remembered nothing. The incident, dismissed as psychological, was never explained. But to those who knew the old stories, it felt like an echo. The rhythm had returned briefly, eerily, and unbidden. And so, the rhythm faded and heard, unseen, but never forgotten. From the cobblestones of Strasbourg to the fields of Ettingen, some footsteps echo across centuries, without music, without reason, only memory. If you found this story haunting, intriguing, or thought-provoking, subscribe for more tales that time tried to bury. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and remember, some mysteries never stop dancing.